The wind moved gently through the thatched roofs of Ezelini, carrying with it the smell of rain and earth. Emily sat by the edge of the compound, her back pressed against the old Mariella tree where her mother used to braid her hair. At 16, Emily had already mastered the art of silence, of watching without being seen, of speaking only when necessary. The villagers often said she had her mother's eyes that knew more than they revealed, eyes that seemed to listen even when no words were spoken. Her days had been quiet since her mother's death. The kind of quiet that didn't come with peace, but with longing. Her father, once a man who hummed as he worked and smiled with his entire face, had grown hollow. He moved like a shadow across the compound, his voice now reserved for commands and prayers. The weight of grief had bent him, and in that bending, something had cracked. When he announced he would remarry, Emily felt nothing. No surprise, no anger. Just a dull ache somewhere deep in her chest. The woman arrived 2 moons later, tall, sharp-cheeked, dressed in foreign fabrics that didn't match the soil of Ezelini. Her name was Mazaniel, and she carried herself like someone who had never tasted struggle. Her son, Cabello, trailed behind her like a cobra freshly awakened, shoulders wide, eyes narrowed with distrust. Cabello was 17. Broad and quick-tongued, with a smirk that curled at the edges like smoke. The moment he stepped onto the compound, Emily felt the change. He moved into her space like it belonged to him, flinging his mat near the fire pit, claiming the shaded corner where Emily kept her calabash, rearranging the stones near the cooking hut without a word. It was like watching a lion spray its scent on every tree. Emily offered him a gourd of water that first evening. He took it, drank deeply, and tossed it aside without thanks. "So, you're the village ghost everyone talks about," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. She didn't reply. Her silence irritated him. Days passed, and the house that once echoed with Emily's mother's laughter now filled with sharp orders and long silences. Mazaniel wasted no time establishing her rule. She rearranged the kitchen, burned Emily's late mother's woven mats, and spoke to her husband with a tone that disguised command as care. Emily's father began to defer, then disappear, first emotionally, then physically, spending more time at the village council hut than in his own home. Cabello, meanwhile, began his silent war. He would hide Emily's slippers, pour water into her sleeping mat, smear leftover maize on her clothes and tell Mazaniel she was dirty. "She acts strange," he whispered to his mother. "I caught her talking to herself in the forest. She's not right." Emily said nothing. She knew what he was doing. But more than that, she could sense what he was. His rage wasn't the loud kind, it was the slow, coiling kind that waited for the right moment to strike. It hid behind smirks and insults, behind his attempts to charm the neighbors and win over the village boys. But Emily saw through it. She saw it in the way he stared at animals too long, how he smiled when the goat tripped on a stone or when a child fell. He liked control. He craved it. Her father began to ask less about her well-being and more about Cabello's. "He's had a hard life too, Emily," he'd say, his voice tired. "Try to make him feel welcome." Emily only nodded. What else could she say? She was already fading into the background of her own home. The acts of cruelty grew. One day Cabello knocked her porridge to the ground and told Mazaniel Emily had refused to cook. Another night, he slapped her across the back when no one was watching and whispered, "Say something. I dare you." Emily held her tears until she was alone. Mazaniel always looked the other way. If she noticed the bruises or the broken sandals or the shift in Emily's eyes, she said nothing. She cooked for Cabello with love, praised him for fetching firewood, and compared him to Emily's father as a boy. Strong. Bold. A real man. Emily began to walk to the forest more often. At first it was just to escape, to breathe in something that didn't reek of suffocation. But soon, the forest became more than a retreat. It became a ritual. She'd go to the same patch of land, just beyond the termite mound where the moss grew thickest. There, she dug. Not deeply, just enough to feel the cold earth on her fingers. She planted herbs, pressed leaves between her palms, whispered words no one taught her but somehow she knew. Birds watched her from the trees. The wind wrapped around her ankles like a memory. She began to hum, low and rhythmic, like a forgotten song returning to her bones. The villagers who saw her from afar said she looked like she was speaking to the ground. Maybe she was. One afternoon, as Cabello laughed with boys in the village square, Emily sat by her forest spot, carving something into the bark of an old fig tree. A symbol her mother had once drawn in the sand during stories of the ancestors, a circle with 3 thorns. She buried a small object beneath it, a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, tied with a red string. She whispered, "Sleep. Not yet. But soon." Then she covered it again with soil and walked back home without looking back. The villagers whispered more now. About Emily. About Cabello. About the shift in the wind and the way the trees seemed to lean toward her when she passed. Some said the girl was cursed. Others said she was waking something. Something old. Emily said nothing. She watched. She listened. And when no one was around, she smiled, but only once. Because deep beneath the forest floor, the secret she had buried was listening too. The morning sky above Ezelini was a deep blue, cloudless and deceptively calm. Emily moved through the compound like a shadow, light on her feet, her eyes lowered as she swept the dust from the cooking hut. She'd learned to make herself small, unthreatening, invisible. But invisibility did not shield her. That morning, Cabello stood over the family's food store, pointing at a gourd of fermented milk and a missing bundle of dried cassava. "She took it," he declared, his voice rising. "I saw her. She sneaks into the store at night. Like a rat." Emily looked up, her lips parted in disbelief. She hadn't been near the store. She hadn't eaten since the night before, when her stepmother served her a spoonful of beans while Cabello had a bowl full of meat and groundnuts. "I didn't take anything," she said quietly, but her words vanished under Cabello's booming voice. "She lies. She always lies," he growled, stepping closer. "She hides food, speaks to trees, and draws evil behind the hut." Her father came out of the house at the sound of shouting. His eyes were tired, his face lined by years of quiet suffering. He looked from Cabello to Emily and back, unsure, hesitant. "She says she didn't," he began. "She's lying." Cabello cut in. And then it happened. It was not a slap of rage, but of shame. A quick, clumsy motion, the back of her father's hand across Emily's cheek. Her head turned with the force. For a moment, the entire compound fell silent. Even Cabello seemed surprised at how easy it had been. Emily stood still. Her face burned, not from the pain, but from something colder, deeper. She didn't look at her father. Instead, she turned slowly, walked past her stepmother, who neither blinked nor spoke, and disappeared into the trees. She didn't cry. She didn't speak to anyone for the next 2 days. In the forest, she dug. Not deep. Just enough to press her fingers into the dark, cool soil and feel the pulse of something ancient beneath it. She whispered to the ants, to the leaves, to the shifting shadows. The forest answered in smells and rustles, in winds that bent toward her like lovers listening closely. In the village market, where she was sent to fetch palm oil, a hunched old woman with eyes too bright for her age grabbed Cabello by the wrist. "Be careful what you stir in a quiet girl," the woman rasped. Cabello snatched his arm back, sneering. "Witch." But the woman only laughed. A low, eerie laugh that followed him through the rest of the day like a drumbeat he couldn't unhear. Behind the hut, Emily began to carve. Small wooden figures, each shaped with care, each etched with symbols no one had taught her. Circles around excess, thorns over hearts. Eyes with no pupils. She lined them behind the hut in a circle, placing a smooth white stone in the center. She hummed as she worked. The same tune she always sang in the forest, soft, wordless, but heavy with meaning. Her stepmother found the idols while fetching firewood. With a cry of disgust, she gathered them, poured kerosene from the kitchen, and burned them in the yard. The flames leapt high. The wood cracked. Smoke spiraled up into the morning sky. Emily watched in silence from the shade of the merula tree. She did not protest. She did not scream. She simply waited until the flames died down. Then she went to the ashes, knelt, and planted a small seed in the warm soil. She covered it with earth and whispered. The next day, Cabello stepped on a thorn and blamed Emily. The day after that, he tripped over a stone she didn't place. Each incident fed his anger. He no longer tried to hide his hatred. He locked her in the goat pen once, claiming she had dropped a calabash of milk. The goats bleated through the night, and Emily sat among them, her dress stained, her arms folded, her eyes closed as though the animals were her choir. She emerged in the morning calm and quiet, her face dirty but unbothered. "The goats are better company," she whispered when Cabello pushed her aside. And then, one afternoon, everything broke. They had been sent to fetch firewood together, a punishment from her stepmother, who claimed she needed to learn how to respect Cabello. Emily carried her bundle silently. Cabello walked ahead, loud and boastful, throwing stones at birds and swinging his machete carelessly through the grass. When they reached the village square on the way back, he turned to her and said, "You think you're special, don't you? With your quiet and your ghosts." Emily didn't reply. She simply walked past him. That was all it took. In front of 3 old men sitting beneath a baobab, in front of 2 children playing with mud figures, Cabello grabbed her by the hair and yanked. She fell backward, her bundle of wood crashing to the ground. He dragged her across the dusty path by her braids, laughing. "Say something now," he shouted. "Talk to your trees now." Her dress tore. Her knees scraped. Blood trickled from her lip. The villagers watched, stunned, too frozen by fear or confusion to stop him. One of the children began to cry. Emily didn't scream. She didn't struggle. When Cabello finally let go, she slowly rose to her feet, her face streaked with blood and dust. She met his eyes. Her voice was low, almost kind. "The ground remembers," she said. Then she turned and walked away. The old men looked at each other. The children stopped crying. And somewhere in the distance, a bird dropped dead from a tree. The forest welcomed Emily like an old friend. Its silence was not empty but full, every leaf carried the memory of wind, every root carried the pulse of stories long buried. She walked barefoot, feeling the throb of the ground beneath her heels. She did not rush. The sun was high, and the world behind her was fading. She reached the place, hidden behind a tangle of acacia and fig trees. There, the soil bore no flowers, only a slight depression, a mark no one else would notice. She knelt slowly, placed her hand on the earth, and whispered, "Soon." The ground seemed to breathe. A single leaf fell from a tree above, drifting slowly, almost reverently. Emily closed her eyes and remembered. She had been 8 when her mother first told her the truth, not in words, but in actions, in symbols. One night, her mother took her to the forest under the crescent moon. They carried no lantern, no fire. Only silence. At a clearing, her mother had drawn circles with ash, broken cola nuts in a particular pattern, and placed a bowl in the center. The bowl was made of carved bone, decorated with etchings Emily didn't understand then. Her mother's face was different that night, both softer and sharper, like someone who had seen the spirit world and chosen to return. "These are not tricks," her mother whispered, her hands guiding Emily's through the motions. "They are not for pride or pain. Only if your spirit breaks, child. Only then may you return to this." The rites were passed down from her grandmother, and from hers before. A lineage hidden beneath silence. Emily remembered every step, every word. She was the last to know them now. After her mother's death, when the morning had turned to silence and her father began to drink deeply from the gourd each night, Emily had returned to that place. She carried what her mother left behind, wrapped in a deep red cloth, tied with palm fiber. Inside had been the bone bowl and a bundle of herbs bound with black thread. She buried them in the hollow beneath the tree roots, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from promise. Now, years later, she pressed her fingers into that same earth. She did not uncover the bundle yet. Not yet. But she spoke to it. They do not see. But the ground does. The trees know me. You know me. Soon. Back in the village, Cabello laughed among a gathering of boys. The chief's son, Leone, clapped him on the back as they sparred with wooden spears. Cabello had a natural ferocity, a kind of reckless fire that impressed boys who had never known real war. He fought with his whole body, grinning, shouting, taunting. Leone watched with admiration. "You fight like my uncle," Leone said, handing Cabello a piece of roasted yam. "He took down 3 men in the border war. You will make a fine warrior." Cabello puffed up like a drum, nodding. "My father taught me." He never mentioned that Amelie's father, now his stepfather, was rarely sober enough to hold a stick, let alone teach war. The village women began to whisper that Cabello would be chosen for warrior training. That he might marry into the chief's family. That Amelie's stepmother was blessed among women to bring such a son. Amelie heard all of this. But she said nothing. At night, her dreams changed. She dreamed of snakes that slithered from under her bed, shedding skin that turned into human hands. Of wolves that stood upright, spoke in her mother's voice, then melted into blood. Of the sky cracking open like an egg, pouring black rain on her hut while the villagers danced in it, laughing. In one dream, her mother sat at the foot of her bed, her eyes weeping red tears. "They broke you, my girl," she said. "Now they must see." Amelie woke with sweat on her skin and the smell of salt in her mouth. The next morning, she began her preparations. From the forest, she gathered herbs that no one else touched, nightshade, dreamleaf, bone vine. She crushed some, dried others, mixing them with ash and oil, whispering over each combination. Behind the chicken coop, hidden in an old calabash, she stored them. She began to hum differently, slower, darker notes, notes that seemed to thicken the air around her. Children who once watched her quietly now avoided her path. Chickens stopped clucking when she passed. Even her father looked away when their eyes met, as though ashamed by something he couldn't name. In her eyes, they no longer held only sadness. They held something deeper. A calm kind of fury. She no longer flinched when Cabello passed by. She no longer lowered her eyes. She watched him. That evening, as the sky bled into dusk, Cabello saw her staring from the water well. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't blink. He smirked, shouted something cruel. Amelie tilted her head and smiled, not with joy, but with a knowing that unsettled him. He turned away, suddenly unsure why his skin crawled. In the forest, the wind began to move in circles. Leaves spiraled in whirlpools without a breeze. The tree above the buried bundle dropped its first fruit of the season, rotten, black, and crawling with ants. Amelie returned to the place the next day. This time, she brought with her a white rooster and a silver coin. She sat by the earth, laid her offerings, and whispered, "It begins." And far away, where Cabello laughed with the chief's son, a sudden gust of wind tore through the gathering, knocking over the wooden practice spears and sending dust into every eye. Cabello blinked, wiping at his face. For the briefest moment, he thought he saw Amelie's shadow in the dust. Watching. Waiting. The village of Ezelwini was alive with music. The annual festival of drums had begun, a sacred night when rhythm carried the voice of the ancestors and fire danced alongside the feet of the living. Smoke from roasting meat drifted above the rooftops, and children raced barefoot across the compound, their faces painted in clay and ash. Amelie sat at the edge of the crowd, her face blank, her feet bare, a thin shawl drawn loosely over her shoulders. She was not painted, not adorned. Yet she drew eyes, because of how still she was, how separate. Like a ghost in the land of noise. Cabello noticed her from the center of the circle. His chest was bare, oiled, his neck decorated with bones from animals he claimed to have hunted, though most had been caught by others. He danced like a wild thing, pounding the earth with his feet, his laughter echoing louder than the drums. When he saw Amelie, unmoving, detached from the celebration, something inside him twisted. Her silence had always irritated him. But lately, it unsettled him. He strode toward her, pushing through the crowd with the swagger of someone who knew he was being watched. "Oh, look," he shouted, grinning for the crowd. "The ghost daughter of the mad woman has come to dance." Laughter erupted. But it was nervous, short. Emily didn't move. "She won't dance," Cabello continued, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her up. "Maybe she forgot how to move like a human." Some chuckled. Others looked away. He didn't stop there. With a sudden motion, he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her forward, throwing her into the center of the dirt circle where dancers had moved just moments before. Emily's shawl slipped from her shoulders. Her thin frame hit the earth hard, and dust bloomed around her like smoke. The drums paused. The silence that followed was jagged and cold. Emily didn't cry out. She didn't groan or look for help. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her knees. Then she looked at Cabello, not with fear or anger, but with something deeper. Something that made even the elders in the circle shift uncomfortably. She turned and walked away. Not hurried. Not ashamed. Just gone. No one chased after her. That night, as the fire died down and villagers began returning to their huts, a sound rose from the center of the village. A single drum, the sacred drum, began to beat on its own. Just once. Then again. Then it stopped. In the morning, the caretaker of the drum, old Mbuso, who had served the ancestors for 50 years, cried out. The sacred drum, carved from the wood of the oldest baobab tree and stretched with lion hide blessed by the first rain, had split. A clean, perfect crack right through the middle. It had stood untouched for 100 years. It had never broken. The elders gathered in silence. None could explain it. None dared. "A bad omen," whispered one. "Something buried is waking." Cabello scoffed at first. "Maybe the wood was old," he said loudly. But he avoided the drum hut after that. He began to sweat in his sleep. That night, he woke with a start. There had been a sound, scratching, light and persistent, under his bed. He held his breath, listening. Then came another sound, soft, nearly a whisper. Cabello. His name, drawn out like the wind through reeds. He kicked over a gourd as he scrambled from the mat. When he looked under the bed, nothing. The next night, it was the trees. The ones outside his window seemed to lean inward, and he heard them rustle even though the wind was still. Again, that whisper. Cabello. He began to sleep with a knife. His stepmother noticed his eyes growing darker, his laughter more forced. One morning, she went out to the chicken coop to collect eggs and screamed. The coop was torn apart. Not broken by claws or teeth, but dismantled piece by piece, as if by someone who had time and intention. Feathers covered the ground in a perfect circle. And in the center, where the earth had been swept clean, was a ring of salt. No blood. No eggs. No chickens. She rushed to the elders, speaking fast, her voice trembling. They gave her herbs to burn. They told her to wash her hands with ash. But they did not come close. Meanwhile, Emily had changed. She began wearing white at dusk, simple cloth, always clean, wrapped tight across her chest and around her waist. Her hair, once left loose, was now braided close to her scalp in quiet defiance. Each evening, as the moon climbed, she walked barefoot to the river just beyond the trees. There, in silence, she removed her wrap and stepped into the cold water. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She would dip under, then stand still in the moonlight as if waiting for the river to speak. Some children followed her once, giggling. But they never did again. When they returned, they said nothing, only stared at the ground, eyes wide. She sang now. Low, wordless songs that curled like mist and carried through the trees. Women fetching water heard it and said it made their bones ache. Men returning late from hunting heard it and walked faster. Emily no longer spoke to people. But the ground seemed to lean toward her. The air seemed to hush when she passed. And Cabello, he began to avoid her completely. But her presence followed him. In his dreams. In the whisper of leaves. In the crack of the drum. The village of Ezzelwini had never felt fear like this. Not from war. Not from drought. This fear was quiet. It wore white and walked by moonlight. The forest of Ezzelwini was ancient, older than memory, older than story. Trees with wide roots and knotted bark towered above like sleeping gods. Few dared go deep within, but Amelie knew its paths by heart. The forest had raised her just as much as her mother had. And now, it was where her soul found silence and where her fury found purpose. She returned under the cloak of dusk. The birds had quieted. Even the insects seemed still, as if something sacred was about to stir. She reached the old fig tree, its roots twisted in a wide embrace of the earth. With her bare hands, she dug. The soil was soft, damp, like it had been waiting. Her fingers touched cloth. She pulled it gently from the earth, a bundle wrapped in faded fabric, stiff with age. It pulsed with a warmth not of the sun. Inside were three things: a stack of brittle papers, barely clinging to legibility, a bowl carved entirely of smooth, yellowed bone, and a single braided lock of hair, the same color as hers, bound tightly in red thread. Her hands trembled. These were her mother's last secrets. She sat cross-legged beneath the tree, her white wrap glowing pale in the forest light, and she began to read. The writings were not just memory. They were instruction. A guide written with urgency and love. They spoke of a power passed down in whispers, the spirit of earth beneath the bones, an ancient force buried beneath the village long ago. It did not kill, for death was too easy. It punished with madness, with truth revealed too sharply, with torment that stripped a person to their soul. It could only be summoned by blood, female blood, from a line that carried both pain and patience. And it could only be awakened in stages. Amelie placed the bone bowl before her and touched the lock of hair. "I won't fail you, Mama," she whispered. Then she began the first ritual. She poured water from the river into the bowl and added crushed ash from the burnt idols, a piece of salted earth, and a drop of her own blood. The mixture sizzled faintly as if the forest exhaled. She chanted the words from the page, each syllable ancient and sharp on her tongue. The bowl darkened, not with liquid but with shadow. The wind picked up. Branches bent low without breaking. Birds flew from trees in frightened bursts. When she returned to the village, something had changed. Animals refused to eat near her hut. The goats backed away when she passed. The chickens flapped in panic and scattered without cause. Even her father, once quick to bark at her, lowered his eyes now, his mouth unsure. The air around Amelie was thick. Even in sunlight, it felt colder where she walked. Cabello, too, felt the shift. He stopped sleeping well. Every creak of the hut made him jump. He would look behind him and swear he saw her shadow moving before she did. Once, while washing his face by the river, he looked into the water and saw her face looking back, even though she wasn't there. He shouted and stumbled back, nearly falling into the water. That night, while others drank and feasted, he stormed toward her hut. Amelie was outside, sitting still, legs folded beneath her, a single white cloth over her shoulders, and a slow-burning fire before her. She didn't flinch when he approached. She didn't blink when he raised his voice. "What are you doing?" he spat. "Are you trying to scare me? You think this makes you powerful?" "Which?" She slowly looked up. For the first time, their eyes locked. What Cabello saw in her gaze chilled his marrow. It was calm, far too calm. No fear, no hate. Only understanding. And underneath it, something ancient and watching. "I forgave you, Cabello," she said softly. He sneered. "You, what?" "I forgave you," she repeated. But she didn't. He froze. "Who?" Amelie simply turned back to her fire. Cabello backed away, as if gravity itself had shifted and the ground beneath her would crack open. He didn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned. Every time his eyes closed, he saw her face, not as she was, but twisted by smoke, her eyes glowing from deep within, her lips mouthing words without sound. Then came the pain. A deep, searing itch in his scalp. He woke in the dark, scratching until he drew blood. He stumbled outside and touched the top of his head, and his hand came away with clumps of hair. He screamed. He wailed like a child until his mother came running. When she saw the patches on his scalp, she gasped and covered her mouth. "It's the girl," she shrieked. "It's that cursed girl. She's doing something to you." But even as she said it, she wouldn't go near Amelie's hut. The next morning, smoke curled from the forest. Amelie had returned to the fig tree. She lit a small fire beside it, placed the bone bowl at its center, and dropped the braided hair into the flame. She whispered a final chant and fed the flame dried herbs, bitterroot, saltbrush, and bones of the last chicken Cabello had once tormented. The fire hissed, popped, then went silent. Not out, silent. The flames moved but made no sound. Amelie leaned forward, her face close to the smoke. "One ritual left," she murmured. The forest listened. The earth shifted. And something deep beneath the ground began to stir. Cabello no longer walked upright through the village. He stumbled, eyes wild and darting, speaking in half-sentences, muttering to the wind, and swatting at things no one else could see. His clothes were torn, and he refused to eat food that wasn't blessed by the village healer, though even the healer had started refusing to see him. Children whispered stories about him. They said he'd been cursed by a spirit he angered, that he now spoke to ghosts and saw snakes crawling from people's mouths. One girl said Cabello had tried to stab her with a carved stick, screaming that her eyes were made of fire and glass. Her mother had pulled her away just in time. The villagers had once admired him, envied him even. Now they watched him with pity or fear. The chief's son, once his closest ally, visited him in secret, hoping to calm him. But Cabello had only hissed at him through clenched teeth, accusing him of betrayal and whispering, she knows what's beneath." The next day, the chief's son made a quiet decision. He told the elders that Cabello was touched by something unclean. He would not be recommended for warriorhood. The shame spread through Cabello's family like poison. Amelie, meanwhile, walked taller. Her posture was unchanged, but her presence was heavier. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened. When she walked through the market, vendors stopped shouting their prices. When she passed the women at the well, they stepped aside in silence. Even the dogs no longer barked at her gate. At home, her stepmother refused to speak to her unless it was to mutter insults under her breath. Amelie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her father came to her one night, eyes sunken and clothes smelling of sweat and old sorghum beer. He knelt beside her fire, his shoulders shaking. "Amelie," he began, voice hoarse. "I don't know what you've done. I don't want to believe the stories. But please, stop. Whatever it is, stop it." She looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only something distant, something far older than his guilt. "You never wanted to know," she said softly. "Even when I cried. Even when I bled. You looked away." He dropped his gaze. For the first time, he did not answer. That night, Amelie prepared for the final ritual. The bone bowl sat at the center of her mat, surrounded by candles made from tallow and herbs. She wore white from head to toe, her face painted with red lines down her cheeks and black dots over her brow. Her breath was slow, deep, like she was inhaling the very pulse of the earth. She walked first to the widow's hut at the edge of the village, the woman whose husband had died of fever just days earlier. The woman was still grieving, rocking back and forth on the floor, eyes red and swollen. Amelie said nothing. She sat beside her, placed the bowl in her lap, and simply waited. Eventually, the widow's tears fell into the bowl, one after the other, like silent raindrops. Amelie bowed her head and left. Next, she made her way to the eastern ridge, where the old graveyard lay. She found an unmarked mound, overgrown with weeds and dry vines. With her fingers, she scooped a handful of soil, cool and smelling faintly of iron, and placed it gently into the bowl beside the tears. Last, she walked to the ruined ceremonial grounds where the sacred drum had cracked. She kneeled in the dirt and gathered the blackened ashes from the splintered drum's remains. They clung to her fingers like soot from a fire that never fully died. With all three elements in her bowl, she walked deep into the forest, further than she had gone in years, to the resting place of her mother. There was no marker, only a wide tree whose roots cradled a shallow mound. Emily knelt before it and placed the bone bowl at its base. The moon was high now, its light silver and sharp. It illuminated the symbols she had carved into her arms with a piece of thorn, spirals, eyes, and a single crescent at her wrist. She began to chant. The words were not from the writings. They came from her memory, from the nights her mother had sung them in lullabies, never telling her what they meant. Now she understood. The air thickened. The trees swayed as if something brushed against them, not wind, but presence. Then came the voice, not heard but felt. It howled like something that had waited too long. The sound rumbled from beneath the soil, from beneath the bones of the forest and the stones of the village. It wrapped around Emily like smoke, pressing into her skin, whispering into the hollow spaces of her heart. She opened her eyes and spoke one final line. Let the roots remember what pain was buried. The candles extinguished themselves. The fire she had made died without smoke. And in that instant, Emily smiled, not with joy, but with relief. She stood and walked back through the trees. The village was silent. At dawn, Cabello was gone. His bedding was torn. The hut door swung on broken hinges. Scratches lined the floor like something had been dragged. There was no blood. Only a single braid of white hair left in the center of the room. His mother screamed when she saw it. She tore through the village, barefoot and wild-eyed, calling his name, accusing everyone, tearing at her dress. When no one answered her cries, she ran into the forest barefoot, hair unwrapped, wailing like a widow. She was never seen again. The village fell quiet in the days that followed. Whispers passed like wind in the fields. The elders spoke in riddles, the children played farther from the trees, and no one dared approach the girl in white. Emily returned to the fig tree once more. She placed the bone bowl at the base of its trunk, covered it with soil, and whispered, "Rest now." Then she stood, brushed her hands clean, and walked home. Seasons shifted quietly, as if the land itself exhaled after a long-held breath. Rain came not in storms, but in soft curtains that soaked the earth and made it generous again. The river no longer overflowed in anger. The crops grew with strange ease, maize thick and golden, cassava roots long and white as bone. Birds returned in larger flocks. The animals no longer scattered at the sound of footsteps. The village of Ezelini, once haunted by quiet dread, became still, and then, peaceful. People began to smile again. They sang while pounding grain. They laughed when the children played too close to the goats. They danced during festivals with joy, not duty. The chief declared that the gods must be pleased at last. But some whispered that it was not the gods who had been satisfied, it was something older, deeper, buried beneath their feet. And Emily? Emily did not raise her voice or claim credit. She walked slowly now, with the weight of memory but the calm of purpose. Her mother's white wrap had become hers. She wore it not as a symbol of mourning, but of wisdom. Children followed her without being called. The girls especially loved to gather around her in the afternoons, when the sun bent low and the shadows of the trees stretched across the earth like sleepy spirits. She taught them the names of leaves and roots. What to chew for fever. What to burn when a child won't sleep. She told them stories, real ones, and ones that danced just between truth and tale. Stories of women who held fire in their hands and walked unharmed. Of rivers that could speak if you sang the right tune. Of ancestors who listened through the roots of trees. Some called her teacher. Some, the one who returned the land. No one dared call her witch anymore. Then, one afternoon, it happened. The sun was high. The sky was clear. The fields shimmered with heat. A cry rang out from the edge of the village, sharp and confused, like a warning wrapped in disbelief. People gathered. Some stepped back. Some stepped forward. A group of boys, out herding goats, had found something crawling through the tall grass near the southern path. It was a man. Or what remained of one. His hair was matted into ropes thick with dust. His skin was scratched and blistered, burned by the sun and broken by thorns. His eyes darted like a cornered animal's. He moved on all fours, like he had forgotten how to stand. His back was hunched. His nails were long. And he made no sound, not even a groan, just soft grunts and heavy breath, as if the very act of living had become a burden. Someone gasped. Another dropped her basket. "It's him," an elder whispered. "It's Cabello." The name spread through the village like fire on dry grass. Cabello. The boy who vanished. The warrior to be. The chief's favorite. The one who had ruled with laughter in the light and cruelty in the dark. Now returned. Crawling. Silent. Unrecognizable. Some villagers ran. Others gathered in clusters, unsure whether to shield their eyes or lean closer. Cabello flinched at their voices. When someone reached out to touch him, he shrieked, a raw, guttural sound, and buried his face in the dirt. Then, from the crowd, Emily stepped forward. She moved without urgency, barefoot, her wrap flowing like mist. The crowd parted for her without being asked. Her steps stirred dust, yet the air felt clearer where she passed. She carried a small wooden bowl of cool river water. She knelt before him. Cabello trembled. His eyes met hers, and he froze. There was a long silence. Then slowly, his limbs shuddering, he crawled to her. Not like a man. Like something broken. He reached for the bowl but stopped, as if waiting for permission. Emily held it to his lips. He drank, gasping, some of it dribbling down his chin. Then he dropped the bowl and clutched at her ankles, his dirty fingers gripping the edge of her garment, his whole body shaking like a leaf in storm winds. She did not move. She looked down at him and said, quietly, so that only those nearest could hear. "Now you know what you buried." He let out a breath, a sound like wind through hollow wood. Then he collapsed. The silence that followed was not peaceful. The elders called for a gathering. The fire was lit high in the center of the village. The people came in droves. Cabello was placed at the edge of the circle, wrapped in cloth, his eyes distant. He rocked gently, muttering nonsense, responding only to Emily's presence. The chief, older and grayer now, stood with trembling hands. "What happened to him?" he demanded. Emily stepped forward. She did not beg. She did not weep. She did not mask her story in metaphors. She told them everything. She spoke of the night Cabello dragged her into silence. Of her screams. Of her mother's despair. Of the death, and the burial. Of the spirits beneath the bones. Of the rituals. Of the bowl. Of the forest. She spoke not with hate, but with stillness. When she finished, the village was silent. Some wept. Some stared. One elder stood, voice hard with anger. "She summoned darkness into our land. She should be exiled. Banished. What if it returns?" But others murmured in dissent. "She brought peace. She restored the land. She spoke the truth when no one else would. She made him crawl, but she did not kill." "She's a prophet," someone whispered. "She's her mother's daughter," said another. The elders argued long into the night. But Emily did not stay. She returned to her hut and slept like one who had earned her rest. By morning, she was still in the village. And when she walked to the forest edge, the trees seemed to bloom behind her. Tiny blossoms sprouted where her feet touched the ground. The birds followed her, flitting from branch to branch. The air smelled of sage and new rain. Emily did not look back. She had no need to. She had returned. But she was no longer theirs. She belonged to something deeper. And the land, finally, belonged to her. Emily stood at the edge of the forest, the place where it had all started. The wind tugged at her wrap, but she held it firmly, as if the fabric of the earth itself had woven itself around her soul. The trees whispered as they had before, old, knowing, patient. They had seen everything. They had witnessed the rise of pain, the descent into madness, and the slow, quiet bloom of revenge. But now, there was a stillness in the air that felt different. She had returned, not to reclaim, but to lay things to rest. Her fingers brushed the earth beneath her feet, feeling the pulse of life that flowed through the roots and into her hands. It was a pulse she had once been part of, a pulse that had bound her to the forest, to the land, and to the spirits her mother had left behind. Today was the final day. She had waited long enough. Kneeling on the soft soil, Emily unwrapped the cloth bundle she had carried with her all these years. The bone bowl, her mother's final writings, and the braided lock of hair lay before her. She whispered a prayer, but not to any god. Her words were not meant for worship, but for the earth itself. "Sleep now, Mama," she said softly, her voice barely a breath against the wind. "The time has come for all of us to rest." The bundle was buried once more, each item placed carefully into the earth where it would remain. It wasn't about closure, it was about honoring the legacy she carried, the weight of a mother's teachings, a woman's power, and a daughter's revenge. The silence that had once bound her now felt like a shroud of peace. She stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked toward the village. The memories were clear in her mind, as vivid as the blue sky above. The taunts of Cabello, the cruelty of her stepmother, the cold indifference of her father. All of it had been buried with the bowl, with the rites, with the earth. Yet the village had changed since then. People no longer feared the silence in Emily's eyes. They had learned to respect it. There were those who still spoke of the days when Cabello had been full of rage, when his shadow had hung heavy over them all. But Cabello was no longer the same. He had become a shadow of himself, crawling on all fours, flinching from the sun, never speaking. The curse that had taken him had not been one of death but of isolation, an existence without voice, without strength. Emily had one, but it wasn't victory she sought, it was balance. She turned away from the village, her heart lighter now, as if she had finally shed the last of her past. As she walked back toward the edge of the trees, a voice broke through the silence. "Why did you do it?" It was a new voice, a girl, no more than 10, standing at the edge of the forest, looking at her with wide, curious eyes. Emily paused, considering the question. She hadn't been asked this in years. "Why did you do it?" the girl repeated, her voice trembling slightly. Emily studied her for a long moment, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. She could feel the earth beneath her feet, the trees that stood as silent witnesses to her journey. This was the moment when she would speak, when she would pass on what she had learned. But the words were simple, as they had always been. Because no one believed silence could scream, Emily replied, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. The girl blinked, confused for a moment, and then nodded slowly, as if some understanding had passed between them. Emily began to walk again, slowly, and with purpose. She didn't look back. The girl would understand one day, perhaps when she, too, found the weight of her own silence pressing against her chest. As Emily reached the outskirts of the village, she saw the old stone path leading into the forest. She had walked it 1,000 times, but this time, it felt different. The earth beneath her was not heavy with the past anymore. It was light, as if it too had been cleansed. She felt the air change, felt it hum with a quiet energy. There was nothing more to do here. The land had been balanced, and her mother's spirit had been honored. Days passed, and the village continued to live with the quiet peace that Emily had left behind. The crops flourished. The elders spoke of her with respect and awe. But there were some who whispered about the girl who had vanished without a trace. Emily's father had died quietly one night, the old man slipping away in his sleep, a peaceful death that seemed so unlike the harshness of his life. Emily had not cried. There had been no need. Her heart was no longer tethered to the pain of a father who had failed her. Her journey had never been about him. Years passed, and the stories of Amelie, the girl who had made the earth remember pain, spread through the village like wildfire. Some called her a prophet. Others spoke of her as a spirit, a force that had once walked among them and had left an indelible mark on their lives. The elders would tell the children of the girl who had buried a secret beneath the ground, a secret that had risen when she was silent, a secret that had shown them that sometimes, revenge did not need to be loud. And then, one morning, Amelie was gone. She had disappeared into the forest once more, leaving no trace behind. Some said she had become a spirit, a silent guardian of the land. Others believed she had simply walked deeper into the forest, waiting for the next soul brave enough to challenge her silence. The truth, however, remained as it always had been. He had dragged her by the hair, but he didn't know she had buried a secret. And it rose from the roots.